Welcome back to another thrilling edition of Horror Story Radio. For our first time listeners, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on another scary tale. Right now, the weather outside is setting the stage for those perfect crisp spring evenings, just right for roasting some marshmallows over the campfire. Today's tale brings to life an old campfire ghost story. But is there something lurking out in the woods, watching us as we listen? Stay gathered round the fire and listen. The Girl on the Rusty Swing.
The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window.
Lonnie began but stopped short once the condescending jeers from around the campfire echoed back at her, her grip tightening on a knotted old piece of pine that served as the talking stick. Lonnie Druitt was one of the least popular camp counselors that summer. Her quiet, introverted personality and average looks didn't win her any popularity contests. After all, teenagers were often superficial and cruel. Typically, she kept solitary company, but when Lonnie heard about the end of summer campfire, she couldn't help but grow excited. With the season turning into fall and the trees shedding their leaves, Lonnie knew it would be time to break out some old ghost stories. The group of counselors would huddle around the large bonfire, the shadows of the red-orange flames dancing and licking their way across their engrossed and slightly inebriated faces. A cool breeze inevitably would flutter through the leaves, the subsequent rustling sound providing the underlying musical score to the many tales told. Lonnie would watch the counselor's spine shiver as creepy words captivated the audience. She would think of the children, asleep in their bunks, utterly unaware of the ghostly frights invading the camp sanctuary. Every year she participated as a camp counselor. She would sit quietly towards the darkest portion of the storytelling circle, listening intently to the others conjure up spirits, demons, and all other sorts of evil things that go bump in the night. She'd intently watch the amateur authors mime out sections with improvised movements, some better than others. Each year when the counselors passed the talking stick in her direction, Lonnie would kindly demur away, playing shy and refusing to speak. This year, she even had one to tell. Deciding to proceed without any further delays, Lonnie resumed her tale.
Old man Nelson Brittles stared vacantly from out the cabin's window. The pallor of his complexion resembled that of a ghost, but he was very much alive. The dark blue suit draped loosely about his sunken frame. One could tell it had fit quite well at one point. His right hand gripped the curtain tightly and pulled it back from covering the window while his left shook out the match. The acrid burnt match smell filled his nostrils.
Lonnie paused then to see if she had gotten anyone hooked yet, but sadly she had not. Most of the other camp counselors were off staring into their phones, actively trying to find their next hookup, while others chugged beers and wandered off. She knew that wouldn't last long, though.
Nelson Brittles had been on his way home when the incident occurred. Not far from here, about 5 miles up the main road against mile marker 81, any passerby may find a faded wooden cross. The cross has long since fallen to its side, so to many it resembles an X, as an X marks the spot. But that night, when Nelson Brittles passed by mile marker 81, that cross wasn't there. In fact, it wouldn't be until the completion of the incident I'm prepared to tell you that the cross would be staked to the ground.
She took stock of her audience, and some people around the fire met her gaze. She unconsciously winked at a couple of girls as they darkened their cell phone screens and took notice.
Mr. Brittles flew around the curve of the road, desperately attempting to return to the sanctity of his home before the sun went completely down. See, it was a night much like tonight, in the early days of autumn. Brittles barely left his house, but on that day, he had a must-run errand to complete. The demonic girl that haunted him day in and day out had grown too much to bear. It had all started innocently enough with the purchase of a new home. Moving day was uneventful, but slowly things changed. Little noises here and there would capture his attention from time to time. Misplaced objects, like car keys, would bother him. He would often question if he was starting to lose his mind. But that was just the beginning. One cold winter's eve, as Nelson settled in by the fire to have his dinner, the girl manifested in front of him. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. After all, he had been nipping at the whiskey bottle most of the afternoon. Try as he might to convince the mind that it was just a figment of the imagination, the girl just wouldn't go away. They stared at each other for hours, neither participant in the standoff making a move or uttering a word. The girl with her dark features stood like a statue, empty eyes coldly fixed upon Nelson. When it came time for bed, she followed him, matching him step for step as his feet hit upon each and every creaky stair. Nelson was so uncomfortable that he didn't even bother changing his clothes, and never fell asleep. He kept one eye on the girl who stood in the corner, just staring at him. She never blinked, not even once. Any attempt to engage with her verbally fell on deaf ears. No expression cracked her face other than that of a stone-cold grimace. Occasionally, the girl would tilt her head to one side as if she were sizing up some prey. Nelson huddled beneath the covers, deathly afraid to fall asleep for fear if he closed his eyes, the girl would descend upon him. And so it went, day after day. The girl would be there, just staring at him. No matter where he went in the house, she was there. When it started, he had friends and would invite them to this house. It wasn't just for the company see. Instead, he wanted validation, which was when the friendship soured. He would press his company on whether or not they had seen the girl. Nelson would insist she was standing right there in the room with them. He would go to great lengths to point her out. He would grab a friend's arm and lead them to her more than once, secretly wanting the girl to latch onto one of them instead. But none of his friends could see her. Slowly, friend by friend, they stopped returning his calls, convinced that he had lost his mind and wanted nothing to do with the whole business. Dinners at a lonely friend's home were one thing, but playing spirit games had grown into quite another. His last remaining friend came over to have a drink one evening when Nelson Brittles jumped straight out of his chair, exclaiming, "She touched me." The last friend had seen enough, put down his drink, and left the premises without a solitary word spoken. Nelson was friendless, but not alone. The girl started to paw at him more often. She climbed onto Nelson's bed and sat cross-legged, staring at him while he dozed off. Sleep had grown uncomfortably challenging to achieve. The girl's constant vigil never waned, and try as Nelson might to stay awake, the human body needs its sleep. But she didn't like when he slept, so she would poke at him to rouse him from slumber. The harder she poked, the more his brain shut down and cried for sleep. It grew to the point that it looked like someone had taken a small ball-peen hammer and beat it on Nelson's skin. Small bluish-purple circles lined his skin from the wrist to the shoulder blades. The experience aged Nelson badly. He stopped sleeping, eating, and eventually grooming. For he couldn't stand the thought of that ever-present girl watching him from the shower, crouched on top of the closed toilet lid, like some kind of twisted gargoyle. Whenever he tried to ignore her, the angrier she became. One morning when he had the idea to leave the house for the day to get away from her, she flattened the tires on his car, the girl always staying one step ahead of Nelson. She would start fires in the kitchen when he tried to go about his day reading or watching TV. Nelson convinced himself the girl was a demon sent to torture him, break him down, and eventually take over the host. Each stage of oppression manifested itself slowly and methodically. But Nelson was more potent than his physical appearance let on. He had enough mental faculty to call for help from priests, mediums, and anyone specializing in the occult. Nothing worked, though. Most of them thought he was some nutcase, while others were more than happy to take his money, only producing abject failure in ending the haunting. It wasn't until after the incident, when the girl straddled his chest in the middle of the night and screamed into his face some eerie Latin words, that he made his final desperate call. An online acquaintance recommended an occultist specializing in demon possessions. The occultist lived more than 3 hours away and refused to come to Nelson. It had to be the other way. Fearing that he would never be able to leave his home, Nelson planned his escape. By then, the girl had taken to seething rapidly in the corners of the rooms he occupied, straddling his body each night, like a succubus feeding. Knowing the end was drawing near, it was like she had been biding her time. She waited for Nelson to break down and give his soul over to her. Many of his previous attempts to flee had been barred, but that morning, as he gathered his belongings and walked to the door, he happened to chance a look back at the girl. She was sitting on the steps across from the front door. She made no move to bar his path and gave off no destructive behavior. It was almost as if she wanted him to go. The very thought of her changing her behavior sent shivers up his spine. He couldn't help the feeling that he was being set up.
Lonnie paused to gauge the audience again and smiled when she realized she had pulled them all in. Even the fraternal order of beer chuggers had stopped and taken seats upon the fallen timber around the fire.
Nelson's visit to the occultist proved more than he expected. The man sat and listened to Nelson's tale, inspected the marks on the body, and wrote down the progression of events. He told Nelson that, in hell, there were legions of demons, most of which stayed in hell. But every so often, one would venture out. To survive, it would have to attach itself to a host. That host could be animate or inanimate, but the latter would limit where the demon could go. To move freely, the demon must possess a soul. He went on to tell Nelson that demons could possess souls in multiple ways. Some offered deals based on the potential host's desires, others maimed and killed to take the body, while others tortured and annoyed until the host gave in. He told Nelson that he could feel blessed he fell into the latter, and that his strong willpower caused him to hang on as long as he had. When Nelson asked why the thing took a girl's form, the occultist replied that a demon would often peer into the thoughts of its prey and pick a thought, an idea, or a person that it could manifest as to protect its true identity. In this case, the occultist felt that Nelson must have some sort of longing for a family, a child, that never materialized. Nelson asserted he was correct. Then there was the mystery of why the thing prevented Nelson Brittles from leaving his home, at least until that day. The occultist stated that if the thing was attached to the house, it must prevent its prey from leaving, for fear that the prey may never return. But that didn't mean the demon would stay attached to the same house forever. There were ways for it to feed off the thoughts and feelings of its prey. Legend had it that the demons often found ways to attach themselves to the prey just like they were objects. Once locked on, the demon would be free to move where the new host went. And while this wasn't total possession, it was good enough to gain another foothold over the victim. Often, the victims thought the events were over when they could leave their homes again. But they were wrong. The occultist spoke of this and many other things. He provided scenarios aligned with Nelson's plight. He cautioned against pretending to know or understand the demon and ruled out any ability to state with absolute authority how the girl might be attached. He suspected that if Nelson had made it to his place unscathed and unbarred, the girl must be attached to the house. A grimace etched itself on Nelson's face as he pondered the various explanations. There had to be a reason why the demon girl had let him wander from the home. Could the occultist be correct? Was the demon girl attached to the house? Nelson jumped to conclusions and convinced himself. Grabbing his coat, he fled from the occultist's house. He had a fleeting hope to return to his home and end this madness once and for all. The last advice the occultist gave him was that fire purifies everything. Nelson knew he needed to trap that demon and burn it. As his car rounded the bend around mile marker 81, the demon girl stood in the middle of the road. Nelson never would understand why. Call it instinct, but he slammed on his brakes and flipped his car into the gully that bordered the road. The world around Nelson violently jarred as his car made its final impact. Luckily, he could crawl from the overturned vehicle, take stock of his wounds and surroundings, and begin to run down the road, droplets of blood leaving a winding trail behind him. When he saw the driveway that led up to the cabin, he took it. He could sense the demon girl following him, matching stride for stride. As he ran, his eyes swept back and forth, trying to find her, but she was nowhere to be seen. Was she hiding behind a tree? Could she be floating overhead, hidden among the cloudy sky? Nelson did not know. Still, he could feel her presence, and it felt angrier than ever. Once Nelson reached the cabin, he rapidly knocked on the door, his fists beating furiously against the solid oak. The repeated hammering sent pain rippling through the bones of his hand and wrist. He shouted for someone, anyone, to come and open the door. He begged for help. Only an eerie silence answered his calls. A strong wind blew up behind him, sending the tumbled autumn leaves that had found a seasonal grave upon the cabin's front stoop into a steady attack against his legs. The cabin remained dark, and the setting sun provided little light to see inside the windows. Seizing the moment, Nelson thrust his shoulder upon the door and broke it open. Upon crossing the threshold, he felt a strange sense of relief that he hadn't in months. Nelson knew instantly that the demon girl was no longer attached to him. The sense of relief he felt was like getting drunk for the first time. He became utterly intoxicated with the feeling that his nightmare might be over. A giant weight had been lifted from Nelson's shoulders. The unsettling feeling of someone watching him constantly ceased the moment his feet crossed the cabin's threshold. Not wanting to waste any time, Nelson slammed the front door shut and began to search around the cabin for a light switch. Nelson didn't know that the cabin was never equipped with modern amenities. The large crucifix hung over the fireplace should have been a dead giveaway the cabin was a priestly sanctuary, but Nelson hadn't connected those dots. He never grasped the concept of a blessed space or hallowed ground. All Nelson cared about was the absent feeling of oppression. He finally located a single candle and an old box of matches near the front window. Striking the match, he lit the candle and began to peer out the window. Scanning left to right, he searched for any signs of the demon girl. To his horror, seated out on the rusty swing set was the figure of the demon child, staring right back at him. Her eyes had grown black, and her mouth displayed gnashed teeth. He could hear the creak of the chains as she swayed back and forth. Their woeful squeak teasing him, reminding him his ever-vigilant companion had not given up her watch.
Lonnie paused for effect and mimed the swing swaying back and forth with her hands. She used her voice to issue a slow squeaking sound in perfect unison with the motion of her hands. Random counselors grew unnerved and looked at each other. They could swear something moved in the trees all around them. The vibrant way Lonnie told her story captivated them. She had done her job well.
Her hand motioned for him to leave the house. The demon needed Nelson to come outside, for it could not cross the blessed threshold. The previous owner had been a priest who battled his demons but had the fortitude to stay strong in his sanctuary. If they remained in the cabin, anyone who passed over the threshold would never be bothered by devilish spirits. Nelson never knew or comprehended that either. With his washed-out and sickly appearance, Nelson Brittles locked eyes with the demon girl. He could see both of their appearances in the twilight-stained glass. His shadowed and haggard, hers resolute. There he stood for hours upon hours, waiting for her to leave. The small area of woods the cabin occupied remained eerily quiet, save for the creaking of the rusty swing set chains. The girl continued to swing back and forth at a slow pace, the deviancy of the act meant to intimidate. The squeaking, rusting chains began to drive Nelson Brittles insane. He commanded the girl to make her move. He shouted for her to come and get him if she could. He defied her entire existence as something made up in his mind. But he could not take his eyes off of her. Hours turned into days, and the demon girl would not leave. The demon would continue its torture of Nelson, though. It would pretend to disappear, only to reappear right up against the window, often as Nelson would doze off, startling him back to awareness. She would rap upon the door, baiting him to open it, for the girl knew if Nelson opened it and took one step across the threshold, she would have him. She could feel his willpower to stay locked up in the cabin begin to wane as she dragged her ragged nails across the window where he remained as a fixed sentry. When she wanted, the girl would retake her creaky throne, and while away the time swaying back and forth, the cacophony of rusty squeaks digging themselves into Nelson's brain, eating away at what remained of his sanity. The girl knew she could outlast Nelson. With each passing day, she could see what little remained of the man. Food and water are two vital essentials humans cannot live without, and she knew neither existed within the cabin's sanctuary. She had watched one other man wither away to nothingness. The priest she had chased, the one who had blessed the old cabin. Nelson Brittles resigned himself to death in that cabin. Years later, a few wandering high school students found the cabin and the body of Nelson Brittles. We buried his decomposed corpse next to the swing set.
Lonnie paused once more. The expressions on the counselors' faces looked shocked at the delivery of the last line of her story. She could see the wheels in their minds spinning, formulating the questions.
You found the body?
How do you know this story?
You made this up.
Lonnie had heard them all before. It had been over 30 years since she found Nelson Brittles' body and buried it. It had been equally as long since she made the pact with the demon to deliver it fresh prey in exchange for eternal life. It was a great deal on both parts. She got her basest desire, and the demon got free passage and unlimited souls. 30 years later, the cross placed by mile marker 81 for Nelson Brittles had faded and collapsed, disintegrating into windblown sawdust. Lonnie would often visit the spot on the road where the demon took absolute control over its prey. Though Nelson's soul was never taken, the demon felt content as it bonded itself to the woods waiting for its next victim, whiling away its time swaying back and forth on the creaky swing. Lonnie stared at her audience around the campfire. The light from the fire flickered against their faces. A mix of emotions danced on their faces. Her dark passenger would feast well that night.
You know, on nights like this, they say you can still hear the creak of those rusty swing set chains. And when you do, they say the demon is near.
Off in the distance, the counselors began to hear the squeak of a swing, moving slowly back and forth, coming closer and closer with each passing second. And that's a wrap, friends. Thanks for listening to today's tale. Come back for the next episode and remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Sleep well tonight.